The radio crackled to life at 0347 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn silence of forward operating base Sentinel. Mayday, Mayday, this is Bravo 7-2. We are taking heavy fire and have multiple casualties. Request immediate extraction. Grid coordinates follow. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Staff Sergeant Madison Torres had been awake for 18 hours straight, but the urgency in that voice snapped her to full alertness. Around the dusty airfield, mechanics were already rushing toward her UH-60 Black Hawk, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like fireflies. In 60 seconds, she would be airborne, racing toward a firefight that would change everything anyone thought they knew about the quiet pilot they called Taxi Driver. But this story doesn't begin with that desperate radio call. It begins 3 months earlier in the sprawling desert of Arizona, where a young woman from small-town Nebraska was about to discover that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons, but with unwavering determination and split-second decisions made under impossible pressure. The helicopter training facility at Fort Rucker stretched across thousands of acres of Alabama countryside, where the humid air carried the constant thrum of rotor blades and the acrid smell of aviation fuel. Captain Rebecca Chun stood at the edge of the landing pad, watching her newest student pilot struggle with what should have been a routine hover exercise. The Black Hawk wobbled uncertainly, drifting left and right as if the aircraft itself was unsure of its purpose. "Torres, you're overcorrecting again," Chun's voice came through the headset with practiced patience. "The helicopter wants to fly. Stop fighting it and start working with it." Madison Torres gripped the cyclic stick tighter, her knuckles white beneath her flight gloves. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the air conditioning, and she could feel the eyes of every instructor and fellow student pilot watching from the observation deck. This was her 7th attempt at the precision hover test, and she knew that failure here meant the end of her dream before it had truly begun. The daughter of a mechanic from Grand Island, Nebraska, Madison had grown up in a world where machines were meant to be understood, respected, and coaxed into cooperation rather than forced into submission. Her father, Miguel Torres, had taught her that every engine had its own personality, every piece of equipment its own language. But helicopters, she was learning, spoke in a dialect she hadn't yet mastered. "Feel the aircraft," Chun continued, her own hands resting lightly on the controls, ready to take over if necessary. "The rotor disc is your connection to the air. Every input you make ripples through the entire system. Be deliberate, be smooth, be confident." Madison closed her eyes for just a moment, remembering her father's words from countless Saturday mornings spent in his garage. "Mia, the machine, will tell you what it needs if you know how to listen." She loosened her grip on the controls, feeling for the subtle vibrations that indicated the helicopter's state of mind. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the Black Hawk steadied. The wobbling ceased, and the aircraft hung motionless in the humid Alabama air, like a 20,000-pound hummingbird. For 30 seconds, then a minute, then 2 minutes, Madison held the hover with a precision that surprised even herself. "Outstanding," Chun said quietly. "Now you're flying." The road to that moment had been anything but smooth. Madison's journey into military aviation had begun during her junior year at the University of Nebraska, where she was studying mechanical engineering with dreams of following in her father's footsteps. The Army recruiting station had been holding a career fair on campus, and she'd stopped by more out of curiosity than genuine interest. Lieutenant Colonel James Richardson, the recruiting officer, had been frank about the challenges facing women in combat aviation. "It's not easy," he'd told her over coffee at the student union. "You'll have to work twice as hard to prove yourself half as much. There will be people who assume you can't handle the pressure, the physical demands, the mental stress. But if you've got what it takes, There's no limit to what you can accomplish. That conversation had planted a seed that grew through her remaining college years. Madison found herself researching military helicopter operations, watching documentaries about combat pilots, and imagining herself at the controls of a Black Hawk. Her parents had been skeptical at first. Her mother, Elena, worried about the dangers, while her father questioned whether she was walking away from a guaranteed career in engineering for an uncertain future in the military. But Dad, she'd argued during a particularly heated family dinner, what if I could use engineering to save lives instead of just fixing cars? What if I could be the person who brings soldiers home to their families? Miguel Torres had looked at his daughter for a long moment, seeing something in her eyes that reminded him of his own younger self when he'd first dreamed of opening his own repair shop. Then you go, Mia, you go and you show them what Torres can do. Basic training at Fort Leonard Wood had been a shock to Madison's system. The physical demands were manageable. Years of helping her father lift engines and transmissions had given her a wiry strength that surprised her drill sergeants. But the mental pressure, the constant evaluation, the need to prove herself worthy of representing the United States Army, that had tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Drill Sergeant Martinez had singled her out during the second week of training, not for punishment, but for what he called special attention. Each morning before reveille, he would have her report to the obstacle course for additional training. Not because she was failing, but because he saw potential that needed refinement. Torres, he'd said after watching her complete a particularly challenging rope climb, you've got something most recruits don't have. You think before you act, but you don't hesitate when action is required. That's rare. Don't let anyone convince you it's a weakness. The words had stayed with her through officer candidate school, through the grueling academic phases of flight training, and through the countless hours of simulator time that preceded her first actual flight in a military helicopter. Each step of the journey had reinforced a simple truth. She belonged here, even if others couldn't see it yet. Flight school had its own unique challenges. The academic coursework was intensive: aerodynamics, navigation, weather systems, aircraft systems, emergency procedures, and tactical operations. Madison had always been a strong student, but the pace was relentless. 12-hour days were the norm, split between classroom instruction, simulator training, and actual flight time. Her flight instructor, Chief Warrant Officer David Sullivan, had been flying helicopters for 15 years and had deployed to both Iraq and Afghanistan. A quiet man with graying temples and hands that never seemed to stop moving when he talked about flying, Sullivan had initially been skeptical about training female pilots for combat roles. It's not about capability, he'd explained to Madison during one of their post-flight debriefings. Women have proven they can handle the aircraft just fine. It's about the dynamics of a crew under stress. In combat, when people are shooting at you, when your friends are bleeding out, emotions run high. I need to know that every member of my crew can function as part of the team, not as someone the team feels they need to protect. Madison had nodded, understanding the concern, even if she disagreed with the underlying assumption. How do I prove that, sir? By being so good at your job that no one questions your place on the crew, Sullivan had replied. By being the pilot everyone wants flying their mission because they know you'll get them home. The training progression had been methodical and challenging. First came basic flight maneuvers, learning to control the aircraft in all phases of flight, from startup and hover to forward flight and auto-rotation landings. Then came instrument flying, learning to pilot the helicopter safely when visibility was limited or non-existent. Advanced maneuvers followed: formation flying, night operations, and combat approach techniques. Each phase built upon the previous one, creating layers of skill and confidence that would be essential in real-world operations. Madison had excelled in most areas, but struggled initially with the aggressive maneuvering required for tactical flying. The smooth, controlled approaches she'd mastered during basic training were inadequate for combat zones we're minimizing. Exposure time was critical for survival. "You're flying like you're approaching a hospital helipad," Sullivan had critiqued after a particularly frustrating training session. "That's fine for medevac operations, but in a hot landing zone, smooth and controlled can get you killed. Sometimes you need to be aggressive, even violent in your maneuvering. The aircraft can handle more stress than you think." The breakthrough had come during a night training mission over the rugged terrain of southern Alabama. Madison was practicing tactical approaches to a simulated landing zone, using night vision goggles that turned the world into an eerie green landscape of shadows and highlights. The exercise called for a rapid descent from altitude, followed by a low-level approach to avoid simulated enemy radar, and finally a steep, fast landing in a confined area. On her third attempt, something clicked. Instead of fighting the helicopter's tendency to want to climb when she pulled back on the cyclic, she learned to use that energy to her advantage. She began to feel the aircraft as an extension of herself, responding to her intentions as much as her control inputs. The descent was crisp and controlled, the low-level approach smooth but aggressive, and the landing firm but precise. "Now you're getting it," Sullivan had said, and Madison could hear the approval in his voice. "That's what combat flying looks like." The final phase of training had focused on mission-specific skills. For Madison, that meant learning the intricacies of transport operations, how to load and unload troops quickly and safely, how to sling load equipment and supplies, how to coordinate with ground forces during insertion and extraction missions. It wasn't glamorous work compared to the attack helicopter pilots who would be engaging enemy targets directly, but it was essential to military operations. During this phase, Madison had first encountered the attitude that would follow her throughout her early career. While the attack pilot candidates practiced air-to-ground gunnery and learned to employ Hellfire missiles and 30mm cannons, the transport pilots were often referred to as bus drivers or taxi service. The implication was clear. They were support personnel, not combat pilots. Lieutenant Angela Morrison, one of Madison's classmates who was training for attack helicopter operations, had been particularly dismissive. "No offense, Torres, but flying a bus doesn't require the same skills as flying a gunship. You're basically an airborne truck driver." Madison had bitten back her first response, remembering Sullivan's advice about proving herself through performance rather than argument. But the comment stung because it reflected a broader attitude she'd encountered throughout training. Transport pilots were seen as less skilled, less important, less worthy of respect than their attack helicopter counterparts. The irony wasn't lost on her that this attitude persisted despite the fact that transport helicopters often operated in more challenging conditions than attack aircraft. While attack helicopters typically engaged targets from a distance and had the luxury of choosing their approach routes, transport helicopters had to land in confined areas, often under fire, to deliver or retrieve personnel and equipment. The margin for error was smaller, the exposure time longer, and the consequences of failure more immediate. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. But Madison had learned to let her flying speak for itself. During graduation exercises, she had consistently ranked in the top 10% of her class for technical proficiency and had earned the highest marks for crew coordination and mission planning. When the assignments were announced, she had requested deployment to a forward operating base, wanting to prove herself in actual combat conditions rather than in the relative safety of a rear area transport unit. Her request had been granted, and she was assigned to the 4th Combat Aviation Brigade operating out of Forward Operating Base Sentinel in Afghanistan. The base, located in the volatile Kunar province, supported infantry operations against Taliban forces operating in the mountainous region along the Pakistani border. It was exactly the kind of challenging environment where Madison hoped to prove that transport pilots were every bit as skilled and valuable as their attack helicopter counterparts. The deployment orders had arrived on a cold February morning in Alabama, just 3 days after graduation. Madison had called her parents that evening, the excitement and nervousness evident in her voice. "I'm going to Afghanistan, Dad. 12-month deployment starting next month." The silence on the other end of the line had stretched for several seconds before her father replied. "Are you ready for this, Mia?" "I think so," Madison had answered honestly. "I hope so." "Then we're proud of you," Miguel Torres had said simply. "You go show them what you can do." As Madison prepared for deployment, she had no way of knowing that the skills she'd learned, the perseverance she'd developed, and the determination she'd built would soon be tested in ways that no training scenario could fully prepare her for. She was heading to a place where the difference between life and death could be measured in seconds, where split-second decisions carried the weight of multiple lives, and where being just transport would prove to be anything but simple. Night before her departure, Madison had sat in her small apartment near Fort Rucker, looking at the wings she'd earned and thinking about the journey that had brought her to this point. In 12 hours, she would board a transport plane that would eventually deliver her to Forward Operating Base Sentinel, where she would begin the real test of everything she'd learned. She thought about Sullivan's words about being the pilot. Everyone wanted flying their mission. She thought about her father's advice about listening to what machines were trying to tell her. And she thought about the radio call that would come 3 months later, when a platoon of American soldiers would desperately need someone willing to risk everything to bring them home. But that night, she was simply a newly minted helicopter pilot, ready to serve her country and prove that sometimes the most important victories come from the quiet determination to do your job better than anyone thought possible. The C-17 Globemaster descended through turbulence over Bagram Airfield, its massive cargo hold filled with the nervous energy of soldiers heading into their first combat deployment. Madison pressed her face against the small porthole, watching the brown mountainous landscape of Afghanistan unfold below. The terrain looked hostile even from 30,000 feet, jagged peaks, deep valleys, and virtually no vegetation. As far as the eye could see, Sergeant First Class Marcus Williams sat across from her, a veteran crew chief who was returning for his 3rd deployment. His weathered face showed the kind of calm that only came from experience, but his eyes held a sharpness that suggested constant vigilance. "First time in country?" he asked, though the answer was obvious from Madison's wide-eyed attention to the landscape below. "Yes, Sergeant," Madison replied, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "You?" Williams chuckled softly. "3rd tour. Different base this time, though. Sentinel's got a reputation for staying busy. Lots of air traffic, lots of missions. You'll get your feet wet fast." The aircraft banked sharply as it began its tactical descent, a steep, spiraling approach designed to minimize exposure to potential ground fire. Madison's stomach lurched as the massive transport essentially fell out of the sky in a controlled dive, leveling out only at the last moment before touching down on the dusty runway. Forward Operating Base Sentinel sprawled across several square kilometers of Afghan desert, surrounded by towering mountains that seemed to press in from all sides. The base was a study in controlled chaos, concrete barriers, razor wire, and guard towers creating overlapping fields of fire around a collection of plywood buildings, modular structures, and aircraft parking areas. The constant noise was overwhelming. Generators humming, vehicles moving, aircraft taking off and landing. And the background, chatter of thousands of people going about the business of war. Madison's first impression was of the smell. The air carried a mixture of dust, diesel exhaust, burning trash, and something indefinable that she would later learn was simply the smell of Afghanistan, ancient, dry, and somehow metallic. It was a smell that would stay with her long after she returned home. triggered by unexpected moments and bringing back memories of this place with startling clarity. The 4th Combat Aviation Brigade's area occupied the northern section of the base, where rows of helicopters sat under camouflage netting or inside reinforced aircraft shelters. Black Hawks, Chinooks, and Apache gunships shared the flight line with smaller reconnaissance aircraft and unmanned drones. The sight of so much sophisticated military hardware in one place was both impressive and sobering, a reminder of the serious nature of the mission they were all part of. Colonel Patricia Reeves commanded the Aviation Brigade, a stern woman in her mid-40s who had earned her position through 20 years of exemplary service and multiple combat deployments. Her office was spartanly furnished but meticulously organized, with maps of the surrounding terrain covering one wall and commendation certificates lining another. She looked up from a stack of mission reports as Madison reported for her initial briefing. "Lieutenant Torres," Reeves said without preamble, "I've reviewed your training records. Impressive scores, good recommendations from your instructors. How do you feel about jumping straight into combat operations?" "Ready and eager, ma'am," Madison replied, standing at attention in front of the colonel's desk. "Good, because we don't have the luxury of a gradual introduction to operations here. Our mission tempo is high, and we need every qualified pilot contributing immediately." Reeves stood and moved to the terrain map, pointing to various locations marked with red pins. "These are active areas of operation. Taliban forces are concentrated in the mountain valleys to the east and north, using the terrain to their advantage. Our job is to support infantry operations by moving troops, supplies, and equipment where they need to be, when they need to be there." She traced a finger along several marked routes. "The terrain is challenging, high altitude, unpredictable weather, and landing zones that are often nothing more than small clearings hacked out of mountainsides. Add in the threat of enemy fire, and you've got one of the most demanding operational environments in the world." Madison studied the map, noting the elevation markings and the sparse road network. "What about medical evacuations, ma'am?" "Critical mission," Reeves nodded approvingly. "We maintain dedicated medevac birds, but in emergencies, any available. Aircraft can be tasked with casualty evacuation. That means you need to be prepared for anything. Routine supply runs that turn into combat rescues, or what looks like a simple transport mission that becomes a race against time to save someone's life." The colonel returned to her desk and pulled out a thick folder. "You're assigned to the dust-off platoon, callsign Mercy Flight. Your primary mission is general transport, but you'll also serve as backup for medical evacuations and combat resupply. Your platoon leader is Captain Ryan Brooks, good officer, with solid experience. Your crew chief will be Staff Sergeant Jennifer Martinez. She's been here for 8 months and knows the area better than some of the pilots." Over the following days, Madison immersed herself in the unique challenges of operating in Afghanistan. The altitude was her first surprise. Forward Operating Base Sentinel sat at nearly 6,000 feet above sea level, and many of the landing zones they served were even higher. The thin air meant reduced engine performance and less responsive controls, requiring adjustments to techniques she'd mastered during training in Alabama. The weather was equally challenging. Morning fog could fill valleys completely, making visual navigation impossible. Afternoon thunderstorms built rapidly over the mountains, creating turbulence that could flip an aircraft upside down without warning. Dust storms appeared from nowhere, reducing visibility to zero and creating static electricity that interfered with radio communications. Captain Brooks proved to be exactly the kind of leader Madison had hoped for, experienced without being condescending, demanding without being unreasonable. A former enlisted soldier who had worked his way up through the ranks, he understood both the technical aspects of helicopter operations and the human dynamics of leading a combat unit. "The key to surviving here," he told Madison during her first mission briefing, "is never getting comfortable. The moment you start thinking the mission is routine is the moment you set yourself up for trouble. Every takeoff, every landing, every mile of flight needs your complete attention. Staff Sergeant Martinez embodied the professional competence that Madison had come to associate with experienced non-commissioned officers. A small woman with an infectious laugh and an encyclopedic knowledge of helicopter maintenance. She could diagnose mechanical problems by sound alone and had an uncanny ability to anticipate what pilots needed before they asked for it. The bird talks to you if you know how to listen, Martinez explained as she showed Madison through the aircraft during her first pre-flight inspection. Every vibration, every sound, every smell tells you something about how the systems are performing. Learn to trust your instincts. If something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. Madison's first mission came 3 days after her arrival. It was supposed to be a simple supply run to a small outpost 20 miles to the north, delivering mail, food, and ammunition to an infantry company that had been operating in the mountains for 2 weeks. The flight plan showed a straightforward route through a relatively secure valley, with clear weather forecast and no known enemy activity in the area. The pre-flight briefing was conducted in a windowless room that smelled of coffee and stress. Intelligence reports indicated quiet conditions along their route, with the most significant threat being the possibility of small arms fire from scattered Taliban fighters. The landing zone at the outpost was described as adequate but confined, requiring a precise approach between rocky outcroppings. Remember, Brooks emphasized as they prepared to depart, just because intel says it's quiet doesn't mean it's safe. Stay alert, trust your crew, and don't take any chances that aren't absolutely necessary. The flight to the outpost was Madison's first real taste of Afghanistan from the cockpit of a combat helicopter. The landscape below was simultaneously beautiful and forbidding. Ancient valleys carved by rivers that had long since dried up, ridgelines that stretched endlessly toward the horizon, and villages that seemed unchanged since medieval times. Occasionally, they would see people working in small fields, tending flocks of goats. But for the most part, the country appeared empty and desolate. The approach to the outpost required threading between 2 tall ridges before dropping into a narrow valley where the infantry had established their position. Madison felt her heart rate increase as the terrain closed in around them, but her hands remained steady on the controls. The training had prepared her for this kind of precision flying, and she found herself trusting her instincts as Martinez had advised. The landing zone was exactly as advertised: small, dusty, and surrounded by soldiers who emerged from fighting positions to help unload the supplies. The entire process took less than 10 minutes, but Madison was struck by the professionalism and efficiency of the ground troops. These men had been living in harsh conditions for weeks, but they moved with purpose and maintained security even during the routine supply delivery. As they lifted off for the return flight, Brooks keyed his microphone. "Nice work, Torres. Smooth approach, good landing. How did it feel?" "Good, sir," Madison replied, though she was surprised by how much concentration the mission had required. "Different from training, but manageable. They all feel that way at first," Brooks said. "The key is building up your experience gradually, mission by mission, until the challenging stuff becomes routine." But Afghanistan had a way of accelerating that learning curve, often when pilots least expected it. 2 days later, Madison found herself facing her first real emergency, when a routine medical evacuation turned into something much more serious. The call came in during the early afternoon. A soldier at a remote observation post had been injured in an accidental explosion while clearing an improvised explosive device from a supply route. Initial reports suggested serious but not life-threatening injuries, and the mission was assigned to Madison's crew as a relatively straightforward medevac operation. The observation post occupied a hilltop position overlooking a strategic valley, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound up the mountainside like a brown ribbon. The landing zone was barely large enough for a single helicopter, with steep drop-offs on 3 sides and a communication tower occupying much of the available flat ground dot. As they approached the landing zone, Martinez spotted the problem first. "Torres, we've got ground fire coming from the ridge to our east. Small arms, maybe an RPG." Madison felt the helicopter shudder as bullets impacted the aircraft's armored belly. Training took over, and she immediately began evasive maneuvers while searching for the safest approach to the landing zone. The wounded soldier was visible on the ground, surrounded by his teammates who were returning fire toward the enemy positions. "Mercy! Flight, this is Outpost 7, the radio crackled with urgency. "We need immediate extraction. Casualty is critical, and we're taking effective fire from multiple positions." Brooks was already coordinating with the ground troops and nearby Apache gunships while Madison focused on getting the helicopters safely to the ground. The approach required flying directly through the enemy's field of fire, but there was no alternative if they wanted to save the wounded soldier's life. "Going in," Madison announced, committing to the landing despite the obvious dangers. The helicopter descended rapidly, using the terrain to mask their approach until the last possible moment. Enemy fire intensified as they became visible, but Madison held the aircraft steady, trusting in the armor plating and her crew's professionalism. The landing was harder than she intended, but the aircraft remained intact as ground troops rushed to load the casualty. Martinez coordinated the loading while maintaining communication with Madison about the security situation. The entire process took less than 90 seconds, but it felt like hours under fire. The takeoff was equally challenging, requiring a steep climb to clear the surrounding ridgelines while enemy fighters continued to engage them with small arms fire. Madison felt the helicopter responding sluggishly due to the high altitude and heavy load, but she coaxed every bit of performance from the aircraft as they climbed toward safety. "Outstanding flying," Brooks said once they were clear of the immediate danger zone. "You kept your head under fire and got us in and out safely. That's exactly what combat flying is about." The wounded soldier survived, thanks in large part to the rapid medical evacuation that Madison's crew had provided. But the mission had taught her something important about the nature of combat operations in Afghanistan. Situations could deteriorate rapidly, and the difference between routine and life-threatening often came down to seconds and split-second decisions. As she completed the post-mission paperwork that evening, Madison reflected on how much she had learned in just a few days of combat operations. The theoretical knowledge from flight school was being rapidly supplemented by practical experience that no classroom could provide. Each mission brought new challenges, new lessons, and new confidence in her abilities as a combat pilot. What she didn't yet realize was that these early missions were just preparation for the test that was coming, a mission that would prove once and for all that being just transport required every bit as much skill, courage, and determination as any other role in combat aviation. The intelligence briefing room at Forward Operating Base Sentinel buzzed with quiet tension as officers from various units gathered around detailed topographical maps spread across folding tables. Major Stephen Caldwell, the base intelligence officer, stood at the front of the room with a laser pointer, highlighting areas of concern along the Pakistani border where Taliban activity had been steadily increasing over the past month. "Gentlemen. Ladies," Caldwell began, his voice carrying the weight of serious concern. "We're seeing a significant shift in enemy tactics and positioning. SIGINT intercepts suggest they're planning something substantial, though we don't yet know the timing or specific target." Madison sat in the back row next to Captain Brooks and several other aviation personnel, taking notes as Caldwell outlined the emerging threat picture. Red pins on the map showed confirmed enemy positions, while yellow pins indicated areas of suspected activity. The pattern was troubling. Taliban forces appeared to be concentrating in the mountainous region northeast of the base. directly along several key supply routes. Our ground units have reported increased IED activity, more sophisticated ambush tactics, and what appears to be coordination between previously independent cell groups, Caldwell continued. We've also detected communications chatter suggesting they may have acquired more advanced weapon systems, possibly including shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles. The mention of SAM sent a ripple of concern through the aviation personnel. Helicopters were particularly vulnerable to these weapons, especially during the predictable flight patterns required for landing and takeoff operations. Madison felt a chill as she considered the implications. The relative safety they'd enjoyed during her first weeks in country might be coming to an end. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison Webb, commanding officer of the 2nd Infantry Battalion, leaned forward in his chair. What's the assessment of their capability to sustain extended operations? Are we looking at hit-and-run tactics or something more prolonged? Based on the logistics indicators we're seeing, they appear to be positioning for sustained operations, Caldwell replied grimly. Weapons caches, food supplies, medical equipment. They're building infrastructure for something bigger than their usual harassment campaigns. After the briefing, Madison walked back to the flight line with Brooks, both lost in thought about the implications of what they'd heard. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the concrete flight ramp, creating heat waves that distorted the view of the mountains beyond. Several helicopters were undergoing maintenance, their engine cowlings open and mechanics working intently on various systems. How much does this change our mission profile? Madison asked as they approached their aircraft. Brooks paused beside their Black Hawk, running his hand along the armored side panel. Everything changes, but nothing changes, if that makes sense. We'll still fly the same missions, support the same units, respond to the same emergencies. But we'll do it knowing that the threat level has increased significantly. He pointed toward the eastern mountains, where intelligence suggested the Taliban were concentrating their forces. The real question is whether command will restrict our operations or double down on aggressive support for ground units. My guess is they'll push harder, try to disrupt whatever the Taliban are planning before it can be executed. That prediction proved accurate over the following weeks. Mission tempo increased dramatically as infantry units launched preemptive operations against suspected enemy positions. Madison found herself flying multiple sorties daily, transporting troops to remote landing zones, delivering supplies to forward operating positions, and evacuating wounded soldiers from an increasing number of firefights. The nature of the missions was evolving as well. Where earlier operations had been primarily routine logistics flights, the current missions carried an edge of urgency and danger that kept everyone constantly alert. Landing zones that had been secure just days earlier were now contested, requiring close coordination with attack helicopters and careful timing to minimize exposure to enemy fire. Staff Sergeant Martinez had adapted quickly to the changing operational environment, modifying her crew chief procedures to account for the increased threat level. She installed additional ammunition storage in the cabin, reorganized medical supplies for faster access during casualty evacuations, and established new communication protocols for coordinating with ground forces during contested landings. The key, she explained to Madison during a maintenance break, is staying flexible while maintaining discipline. When things get chaotic, and they will, you fall back on your training and trust your crew. But you also have to be ready to adapt when the situation changes faster than your procedures can keep up. Madison had begun to understand what Martinez meant during a mission 3 days after the intelligence briefing. They were tasked with extracting a reconnaissance team that had been observing Taliban movements in a remote valley when their position was compromised. What should have been a straightforward pickup had become a running firefight as the team fought their way to the landing zone while under pursuit by a much larger enemy force. The approach to the extraction point required flying through a narrow canyon where enemy fighters had positioned themselves on both sides of the valley. Madison could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions as they descended toward the landing zone, and she felt the helicopter shudder as bullets struck the aircraft's armor plating. Taking fire from both sides, Martinez reported calmly, her voice steady despite the intensity of the situation. Ground team is in sight, approximately 100 meters from the LZ. The reconnaissance team was visible as small figures moving rapidly down the valley floor, stopping periodically to return fire at their pursuers. Madison could see that they were heavily loaded with equipment and moving slower than ideal for the tactical situation. The helicopter would need to land in an exposed position and remain there long enough for the team to reach safety. "Mercy Flight, this is Recon 7, the radio crackled with the team leader's voice. "We're taking heavy fire and have one walking wounded. Need immediate extraction or we're not going to make it to the LZ." Brooks was already coordinating with nearby Apache gunships to provide covering fire, but the terrain limited their ability to engage enemy positions without risking civilian casualties in the valley below. The extraction would depend primarily on Madison's ability to get the helicopter in and out quickly while under fire. "Going in," Madison announced, committing to the landing despite the obvious risks. The helicopter descended rapidly, using the terrain features to mask their approach until the last possible moment. As they became visible to the enemy fighters, the intensity of incoming fire increased dramatically. The landing was rougher than Madison intended, but the aircraft remained functional as the reconnaissance team sprinted toward the helicopter. Martinez had positioned herself at the cabin door, providing covering fire while coordinating the loading of personnel and equipment. The team's wounded member was helped aboard first, followed quickly by the rest of the soldiers and their gear. "We're loaded, go, go, go," Martinez shouted as the last soldier scrambled aboard. Madison pulled maximum power and began climbing steeply to clear the surrounding ridgelines. Enemy fire followed them as they climbed, but the helicopter's armor held, and they reached safety without sustaining critical damage. The mission debriefing revealed important intelligence about Taliban capabilities and intentions. The reconnaissance team had observed a significant concentration of fighters and equipment in the valley, including what appeared to be advanced communications gear and heavy weapons. More concerning was evidence of coordination between multiple enemy groups, suggesting a level of organization that hadn't been seen before in the region. "They're definitely planning something big," Captain Brooks observed as they reviewed the intelligence reports. "The question is whether we can figure out what it is before they execute it." Madison had noticed something else during the mission that concerned her. The Taliban fighters had demonstrated improved small arms discipline and what appeared to be better training in anti-aircraft tactics. Their fire had been more concentrated and sustained than in previous encounters, suggesting either better training or leadership, or both. Over the following week, the pattern of increasing enemy sophistication continued. Several helicopter crews reported encounters with more effective ground fire, and there were unconfirmed reports of possible SAM launches, though no aircraft had been hit. The enemy appeared to be learning from each engagement, adapting their tactics to become more effective. Against coalition air operations, the strain was beginning to show on everyone at the base. Pilots were flying longer hours with shorter rest periods between missions. Maintenance crews were working around the clock to keep aircraft operational, despite the increasing battle damage from enemy fire. Ground forces were reporting higher casualty rates as they encountered better trained and better equipped Taliban fighters. Madison found herself thinking more frequently about home during the brief periods between missions. Letters from her parents arrived irregularly, carrying news of Nebraska weather and her father's latest mechanical projects. The normalcy of their lives seemed increasingly distant from her current reality of daily combat missions and the constant threat of enemy fire. One evening, while writing a response to her parents' latest letter, Madison realized how much she had changed since arriving in Afghanistan. The nervous young pilot who had landed at Bagram Airfield just weeks earlier had been replaced by someone more confident, more capable, and more aware of both her own abilities and limitations. The missions that had seemed impossibly challenging during her first week were now routine, and she found herself taking on increasingly complex assignments without hesitation. But with that confidence came a growing awareness of the risks involved. In their operations, several other pilots had been wounded in recent weeks, and one helicopter had been forced to make an emergency landing after taking heavy damage from enemy fire. The reality of combat aviation was that competence and experience provided no guarantee of survival. Sometimes bad things happen to good pilots, despite their best efforts and professional skill. Staff Sergeant Martinez had noticed the change in Madison's demeanor and approached her one evening as they completed post-flight maintenance on their aircraft. "How are you holding up, Lieutenant? I know the pace has been pretty intense lately." Madison looked up from the maintenance logbook she was completing. "I'm fine, Sergeant. Why do you ask?" "Because I've been doing this long enough to recognize when someone is processing the reality of what we do here," Martinez replied. "It's normal to have doubts, to wonder about the risks. The key is not letting those thoughts interfere with your ability to do the job." "I'm not having doubts," Madison said, though even as she spoke the words, she wasn't entirely sure they were true. "I just want to make sure I'm ready for whatever comes next." Martinez nodded knowingly. "That's exactly what I mean. You're thinking like a combat pilot now, always preparing for the worst-case scenario. That's good, as long as it doesn't become paralyzing fear." As they secured the aircraft for the night, Madison reflected on Martinez's words. She was changing, becoming someone different from the person who had arrived in Afghanistan with hopes of proving herself worthy of respect. The question was whether she was becoming someone stronger and more capable, or someone harder and more cynical. Perhaps, she thought, the answer was both. The intelligence briefings continued to paint an increasingly concerning picture of enemy activities in the region. Taliban forces appeared to be moving into final positions for whatever operation they were planning, and coalition forces were scrambling to identify and disrupt their plans before it was too late. For Madison and her fellow pilots, that meant more missions, higher risks, and the growing certainty that they were approaching a decisive confrontation that would test everyone's skills and courage to their limits. What none of them could have predicted was how soon that test would come, or how dramatically it would change everything they thought they knew about courage under fire. The pre-dawn darkness at Forward Operating Base Sentinel carried an unusual stillness that made everyone uneasy. Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Kim stood outside the Tactical Operations Center, sipping coffee from a metal cup and studying the eastern horizon where the first hints of dawn were beginning to appear. As the senior intelligence analyst for aviation operations, Kim had developed an instinct for reading the subtle signs that preceded major enemy actions, and everything about this morning felt wrong. Inside the operations center, banks of radio equipment crackled with routine traffic from various units conducting normal security patrols and checkpoint operations. But Kim noticed what wasn't there: the usual pattern of intercepted Taliban communications that had become background noise over the past weeks. The sudden radio silence from enemy forces was more ominous than increased chatter would have been. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Patterson, the base operations officer, emerged from her office carrying a stack of overnight intelligence reports. Her expression was grim as she approached Kim's workstation. "Daniel, what are you seeing from the overnight intercepts?" "That's just it, ma'am. We're not seeing anything," Kim replied, pulling up signal intelligence data on his computer screen. "All the communication patterns we've been tracking for the past month went dark around 0200 hours. No routine traffic. No coordination signals, nothing." Patterson studied the data, her concern growing as the implications became clear. Either they've changed their entire communication protocol simultaneously, or they've moved to radio silence because they're about to initiate whatever they've been planning. She moved to the large situation map that dominated one wall of the operations center, studying the red pins that marked known enemy positions. The pattern that had emerged over recent weeks showed Taliban forces positioned in a rough semicircle around the mountainous approaches to the base, with particular concentrations along the supply routes that connected Sentinel to other coalition facilities. "Get me Colonel Reeves on the secure line," Patterson ordered, "and wake up the duty officer for every unit on base. If this is what I think it is, we need to be ready for anything." Across the base, Madison was conducting her routine preflight inspection of their Black Hawk, using a red-filtered flashlight to check critical components without destroying her night vision. The aircraft had accumulated over 40 hours of flight time in the past 2 weeks, and she could see the toll that constant operations were taking on the machine. Bullet holes in the fuselage had been patched with aluminum tape, stress cracks. In the windscreen showed where impacts had been repaired, and the entire aircraft bore the dusty, worn appearance of equipment being pushed to its operational limits. Staff Sergeant Martinez emerged from the crew quarters, her flight helmet and gear bag slung over her shoulder. "Morning, Lieutenant. Sleep okay?" "About as well as anyone sleeps around here," Madison replied, closing an access panel after checking the oil levels. "You notice how quiet it's been? No incoming fire, no mortar, nothing for the past 6 hours." Martinez paused in her own preflight. "Preparations, listening to the ambient sounds of the base. Now that you mention it, yeah. Usually we get at least some harassment fire during the night. Either they're planning something, or they've given up and gone home." "Somehow I don't think they've given up," Madison said dryly. Their conversation was interrupted by the sharp electronic tone of the base-wide announcement system. all personnel, this is base operations. Threat Condition Charlie is now in effect. All units implement enhanced security measures immediately. Aviation personnel report to the flight line for emergency briefing." Madison and Martinez exchanged glances as they grabbed their remaining gear and headed toward the briefing facility. Around them, the base was coming alive with the controlled urgency of a military installation preparing for combat. Security teams were moving to defensive positions. Vehicle patrols were being augmented, and the distinctive sound of helicopter engines starting could be heard from various points around the flight line. The aviation briefing room was packed with pilots, crew chiefs, and maintenance personnel from all the helicopter units on base. Colonel Reeves stood at the front of the room, her usually composed demeanor showing signs of strain as she waited for everyone to settle into their seats. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began without preamble, "intelligence indicates that we may be facing a coordinated enemy attack within the next few hours." All Taliban communications went silent at 0200 hours, and we have reports of movement from multiple observation posts around the base perimeter. She gestured toward a detailed map of the surrounding terrain that had been set up on an easel. "Based on the positioning we've observed over the past month, we believe they intend to simultaneously attack several of our forward operating bases, while disrupting the helicopter operations that provide critical support to our ground forces." Captain Brooks raised his hand from the middle of the room. "Ma'am, what's the intelligence assessment of their anti-aircraft capabilities?" "Unknown, but we have to assume they have acquired shoulder-fired missiles," Reeves replied grimly. "All aircraft will operate under the assumption that SAM threats exist at any altitude below 8,000 feet. That's going to complicate close support missions, but it's better than losing aircraft to preventable shootdowns." The briefing continued with specific guidance for various types of missions, communication protocols for operating under increased threat conditions, and coordination procedures with ground forces. Madison took careful notes, but her mind was also processing the broader implications of what they were facing. If the Taliban had indeed acquired advanced surface-to-air missiles, helicopter operations would become exponentially more dangerous, particularly the low-altitude missions that were essential for supporting infantry units in mountainous terrain. As the briefing concluded, pilots dispersed to their aircraft to begin final preparations for what promised to be a challenging day. Madison walked back to her helicopter with Brooks and Martinez, all three lost in thought about the tactical problems they might soon face. "The thing that worries me most," Brooks said as they approached their aircraft, "is that we're going to be asked to fly missions that push the envelope of what's tactically sound. When ground units are in trouble, there's always pressure to take risks that might not be justified by the probability of success." Madison understood what he meant. Helicopter crews had a well-deserved reputation for accepting dangerous missions to support ground forces, but there was a line between acceptable risk and suicide missions. The challenge would be recognizing where that line was when they were making decisions under pressure with incomplete information. The first indication that the Taliban offensive had begun came at 0630 hours, just as the sun was clearing the eastern mountains. A series of explosions echoed across the base as mortar began impacting within the perimeter, followed immediately by the distinctive crack of small arms fire from multiple directions. The base's defensive systems responded immediately, with counter-battery fire and automatic weapons engaging targets along the perimeter. All aircraft, this is base operations," the radio crackled with urgent instructions. "We are under attack from multiple directions. All flyable aircraft prepare for immediate departure. Priority missions will be assigned as the tactical situation develops." Madison was already strapping into her seat as Martinez completed the emergency startup procedures that would get them airborne in minimum time. Around them, other helicopters were spinning up their rotors as crews prepared for whatever missions would be assigned. The base's Apache gunships were already lifting off to engage enemy positions, their 30mm cannons and Hellfire missiles providing immediate close air support for the ground defenders. "Mercy Flight, this is base operations," their radio crackled. With the first mission assignment, "We have a convoy under attack en route Tampa, approximately 15 kilometers north of base. Multiple casualties reported, immediate medevac required." Madison felt her pulse quicken as she acknowledged the mission and began plotting a course to the convoy's location. Route Tampa was one of the main supply roads connecting their base to forward positions, and convoys using that route were always vulnerable to ambush in the mountainous terrain. If the Taliban had coordinated their attack properly, they would have positioned forces to interdict any rescue attempts. The takeoff was unlike anything Madison had experienced during her deployment. Instead of the usual single aircraft departing on routine missions, the entire flight line was launching simultaneously, as helicopters scattered to respond to multiple emergencies occurring across their area of operations. Attack helicopters headed toward known enemy positions, transport aircraft moved to extract isolated units, and medical evacuation helicopters raced toward locations where American forces were taking casualties. As they climbed away from the base, Madison could see smoke rising from several points around the perimeter where enemy mortar had found their targets. The base's defensive systems were responding effectively, but it was clear that this was a much more sophisticated and coordinated attack than anything they had faced previously. "Mercy Flight, be advised that the route Tampa convoy is still in contact with enemy forces," the radio updated them as they flew north toward the ambush site. "Ground commander reports they are pinned down by fire from elevated positions and cannot move casualties to a secure landing zone." Brooks was already coordinating with nearby attack helicopters to provide covering fire for their approach, but Madison knew that the mission would ultimately depend on her ability to get the helicopter into a contested landing zone while under fire. It was exactly the kind of situation that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones, and she felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. The convoy came into sight as they crested a ridgeline, and Madison could immediately see the tactical problem they faced. Several vehicles were burning along the road, with American soldiers taking cover behind the remaining trucks while enemy fire poured down from positions in the rocks above. The only possible landing zone was a small clearing next to the road, directly exposed to enemy observation and fire. Taking fire from multiple positions, Martinez reported, as bullets began impacting their aircraft. Ground team has casualties laid out and ready for extraction, but they can't move them to cover. Madison studied the terrain, looking for any tactical advantage that might improve their chances of completing the mission successfully. The enemy positions were well chosen, commanding excellent fields of fire over the road and any possible landing areas. A direct approach would expose them to concentrated fire for an extended period, while an indirect approach would take time. They probably didn't have dot. It was the kind of tactical problem that had no perfect solution, only options with different types and levels of risk. Madison made her decision and committed to an aggressive direct approach that would minimize their exposure time while accepting higher risk during the critical landing phase. "Going in," she announced, beginning a steep descent toward the landing zone while enemy fire intensified around them. The helicopter shuddered as bullets found their mark, but the aircraft systems remained functional as Madison fought to maintain control during the approach. What happened next would test everything she had learned about flying helicopters in combat and prove that sometimes the most important battles are won not by the most heavily armed aircraft, but by the pilots willing to risk everything to bring their fellow soldiers home. The helicopter shuddered violently as armor-piercing rounds punched through the aircraft's belly, sending sparks cascading across the cabin floor. Madison fought to maintain control as hydraulic fluid began spraying from damaged lines, coating the windscreen in a fine mist that made visibility even more challenging. The landing zone rushed up to meet them at an alarming rate, with muzzle flashes winking from the rocky positions above like deadly stars. "Hydraulics are failing," Madison called out, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "We're going to have a hard landing." Staff Sergeant Martinez was already moving in the cabin, securing loose equipment and preparing for the impact she knew was coming. Through her headset, she could hear the wounded soldiers on the ground calling for immediate evacuation, their voices tight with pain and desperation. The convoy's medic was shouting coordinates and casualty counts, painting a picture of men dying while enemy fire prevented their rescue. The Black Hawk hit the ground with bone-jarring force, bouncing once before settling heavily on its landing gear. Madison kept the engines running at flight idle, knowing they would need every available second to complete the evacuation and get airborne before enemy fighters could adjust their fire onto the stationary helicopter. "We're taking effective fire from the North Ridge," Martinez reported, her voice calm despite bullets snapping overhead. "Ground team is moving casualties toward us now." Through the dust kicked up by their rotor wash, Madison could see American soldiers carrying their wounded comrades toward the helicopter. The convoy commander, a captain whose name tape read Morrison, was directing the evacuation while simultaneously coordinating defensive fire against the Taliban positions. His left arm hung useless at his side, clearly broken, but he continued to function with the kind of professional determination that Madison had come to associate with infantry officers. The first casualty was a young private who had taken shrapnel to his legs from an improvised explosive device. As Martinez and the convoy medic loaded him into the helicopter, Madison could see the extent of his injuries through the cabin mirror. The soldier was conscious but pale, his eyes wide with shock as medical personnel worked to stabilize his condition for the flight to the base hospital. "How many more?" Madison called back to Martinez, watching the fuel gauges and engine parameters while keeping one eye on the enemy positions above them. 4 walking wounded and 2 stretcher cases," Martinez replied, helping to secure the wounded private on a litter. Ground commander says they can handle the walking wounded in their remaining vehicles if we can take the critical casualties. Madison nodded, understanding the tactical calculus involved. The helicopter could carry all the wounded, but that would mean leaving some of the convoy's combat-effective soldiers behind, potentially dooming them to capture or death if their defensive position was overrun. By taking only the most seriously injured, they preserved the unit's combat strength, while saving the lives that were most at risk. The second stretcher case presented a more complex challenge. Sergeant David Kowalski had been the convoy's machine gunner when his position took a direct hit from a rocket-propelled grenade. The explosion had left him with severe burns and internal injuries that required immediate surgical intervention. As they loaded him aboard, Madison could hear him mumbling about his weapon, his professional instincts still functioning despite his critical condition. "Tell my wife," Kowalski began, but Martinez cut him off with gentle firmness. "You can. Tell her yourself when you get home, Sergeant. Right now we need you to stay quiet and let us do our job." Enemy fire intensified as the Taliban fighters realized the helicopter was attempting to evacuate casualties. Bullets sparked off the aircraft's armor plating, while rocket-propelled grenades exploded nearby, sending shrapnel singing through the air. Madison felt the helicopter lurch as a heavy machine gun round punched through the tail boom, but the aircraft's flight controls remained responsive. "We need to go now," Brooks called from the right seat, his eyes fixed on the approaching muzzle flashes that indicated enemy fighters were moving to flank their position. Madison pulled pitch and felt the helicopter struggle to lift off with its heavy load of wounded soldiers and medical equipment. The damaged hydraulic system made the controls sluggish and unpredictable, requiring constant corrections to maintain stable flight. As they climbed away from the landing zone, she could see the convoy's remaining vehicles beginning to move, using the distraction of the helicopter evacuation to break contact with the enemy forces. The flight back to forward operating base Sentinel became a race against time as the wounded soldiers fought for their lives in the helicopter's cabin. Martinez worked frantically to maintain 4 lines and monitor vital signs while the aircraft bucked and shuddered through the turbulent mountain air. The helicopter's damaged systems created additional challenges, with warning lights illuminating across the instrument panel as various components began to fail. "Blood pressure on the burn victim is dropping," Martinez reported through the intercom. "We need to get him to surgery within the next 10 minutes or we're going to lose him." Madison pushed the helicopter's engines beyond their normal operating limits, trading mechanical reliability for speed as they raced across the mountainous terrain toward the base. The aircraft was consuming fuel at an alarming rate due to the battle damage, but she calculated they had enough to reach their destination. With minimal reserves as they approached the base, Madison could see that the Taliban attack was continuing with undiminished intensity. Smoke rose from multiple points within the perimeter where mortar rounds had found their targets, while the distinctive muzzle flashes of automatic weapons created a deadly light show along the defensive positions. Apache gunships circled the base like mechanical predators, their 30mm cannons chattering as they engaged enemy positions. "Mercy Flight, this is base operations," the radio crackled with urgent instructions. "Landing Zone Alpha is under fire. Divert to Landing Zone Bravo near the medical facility. Ground crews are standing by for immediate casualty transfer." Madison acknowledged the transmission and adjusted her approach to the alternate landing zone, fighting the increasingly unresponsive flight controls as hydraulic fluid continued to leak from damaged lines. The helicopter felt like it was flying through thick syrup, requiring constant pressure on the controls to maintain directional control. The landing at the medical facility was rougher than Madison would have preferred under normal circumstances. But the wounded soldiers were transferred to waiting medical teams within seconds of touchdown. As stretcher bearers rushed the casualties toward the emergency treatment facility, Madison caught a glimpse of Sergeant Kowalski's face as he was wheeled past her aircraft. He was still conscious, his eyes tracking movement around him with a awareness that suggested he might survive his injuries. "Outstanding flying," Brooks said as they watched the medical teams disappear into the hospital. "That approach and extraction was textbook combat aviation. You got those soldiers out when no one else could have done it." But there was no time to appreciate the successful mission, even as maintenance crews began assessing the helicopters. Battle damage, new mission taskings were coming in over the radio. Taliban forces had successfully ambushed another convoy 20 kilometers to the east, and a forward observation post was reporting that they were surrounded and running low on ammunition. The coordinated enemy offensive was succeeding in multiple locations simultaneously, stretching coalition forces beyond their ability to respond effectively. "Mercy Flight, stand by for immediate retasking," the radio announced. "We have a priority mission developing in Sector 7, multiple casualties and urgent resupply required." Madison looked at the fuel gauges and system status displays, calculating whether their damaged helicopter could handle another combat mission. Several warning lights remained illuminated. The hydraulic system was operating at reduced capacity, and they had less than an hour of fuel remaining. Under normal circumstances, the aircraft would be grounded for repairs before returning to service, but these weren't normal circumstances. Across the base, every available aircraft was being pushed beyond normal operating limits as aircrews responded to the crisis. Maintenance personnel were conducting field repairs under fire. Pilots were flying with battle damage that would normally require immediate landing, and everyone was accepting risks that peacetime procedures would never allow. "Can we make another mission?" Madison asked Martinez, who was already conducting a rapid inspection of their aircraft's critical systems. "The bird will fly," Martinez replied, her assessment both professional and honest. "Whether it will get us home is another question. But if there are soldiers out there who need our help, then we go." The decision illustrated something fundamental about combat aviation that Madison was only beginning to understand. The technical aspects of flying helicopters, the procedures, the systems knowledge, the mechanical skills were important, but they weren't what separated good pilots from exceptional ones. The defining characteristic of combat aviators was their willingness to accept personal risk in service of the mission and the soldiers who depended on them. As Madison strapped back into her seat and began the startup procedures for their next mission, she realized that she was no longer the uncertain young pilot who had arrived in Afghanistan just months earlier. The woman now sitting at the controls of this battle-damaged helicopter had been tested under fire and proven herself capable of making life-and-death decisions under impossible pressure. But the greatest test was still ahead of her. Somewhere in the mountains to the north, an American infantry platoon was fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds, and their only hope for survival would depend on a pilot they had dismissed as just transport being willing to risk everything to bring them home. The radio crackled to life with coordinates for their next mission, and Madison felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied the beginning of another combat operation. She had no way of knowing that this mission would define not only her own reputation, but also demonstrate to everyone who witnessed it that courage and skill could not be measured by the type of aircraft someone flew, but by their willingness to use it in service of others when everything was on the line. The Tactical Operations Center at Forward Operating Base Sentinel had transformed into a nerve center of controlled chaos as staff officers tracked multiple simultaneous crises across their area of responsibility. Banks of radio equipment filled the air with overlapping transmissions from units under fire, requests for immediate support, and urgent casualty reports. Major Stephen Caldwell stood before the main situation board, updating unit positions with red markers that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. Colonel Patricia Reeves moved between radio stations, coordinating the base's response to what had become the largest coordinated Taliban offensive in the region's recent history. Her calm demeanor masked the growing concern she felt as reports continued to arrive of successful enemy attacks on isolated outposts and supply convoys. The Taliban had clearly planned this operation for months, positioning forces to strike simultaneously at multiple targets, while coalition forces were spread too thin to respond effectively. "Ma'am, we have a priority transmission from Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion." Communications Specialist Tyler Johnson called from his station. "They're requesting immediate extraction from Observation Post Delta. Heavy casualties and running low on ammunition." Reeves moved to Johnson's station and took the handset. "Bravo 7-2, this is Sentinel Base. Send your situation report." The voice that came through the radio was tight with strain and barely controlled desperation. First Lieutenant Marcus Webb, commanding officer of the 28-man platoon stationed at Observation Post Delta, had been fighting continuously for 6 hours against an enemy force that outnumbered his unit at least 4-1. "Sentinel Base, we are surrounded and taking heavy fire from all directions," Webb reported, his words punctuated by the distinctive crack of incoming rounds and the deeper thump of exploding mortar. "We have 14 wounded, including my platoon sergeant and both squad leaders. Ammunition situation is critical. We've got maybe 30 minutes of effective fire before we're down to individual weapons only." The tactical situation at Observation Post Delta represented every ground commander's nightmare. The position had been established on a hilltop overlooking a strategic valley, providing excellent observation of enemy movement routes but offering limited options for withdrawal under fire. Taliban forces had spent weeks positioning fighters in the surrounding terrain, creating overlapping fields of fire that made any attempt to leave the observation post extremely hazardous. "What's your assessment of the enemy's strength?" Reeves asked, already calculating the resources required for an extraction mission. "Conservative estimate is 150 fighters in prepared positions," Webb replied. "They've got mortar, heavy machine guns, and at least 2 RPG teams that I can identify. We've been calling for air support, but I understand the Apaches are committed to other missions." Reeves looked at the aircraft status board, where magnetic tiles showed the disposition of every helicopter on the base. Half of their attack helicopters were supporting the base's own defense, while the remainder were committed to other priority missions across the region. The transport helicopters available for extraction missions had been reduced to just 3 aircraft due to battle damage and maintenance requirements. "Bravo 7-2, stand by for mission coordination," Reeves replied. "We're working on your extraction now." She turned to Major Caldwell, who was already plotting courses and calculating flight times to the observation post. The tactical problem was straightforward but daunting. They needed to insert enough helicopters to evacuate 28 soldiers while providing sufficient firepower to suppress enemy positions during the extraction. With limited air assets available, it would require precise timing and exceptional flying to accomplish the mission successfully. "What aircraft do we have available for immediate tasking?" Reeves asked. Caldwell consulted his status board before responding. 2 Apache gunships just completed their ammunition reload and can be airborne in 15 minutes. For transport, we have Mercy Flight with battle damage but still flyable, Ghost Rider with a full crew but low fuel, and Iron Eagle that just completed maintenance checks. "What about Mercy Flight's battle damage assessment?" "Hydraulic system operating at 60%, minor structural damage to the tail boom, and some electronics interference from bullet impacts. Crew Chief Martinez says it's flyable but marginal for extended operations." Reeves studied the map, calculating distances and fuel requirements for the mission. Observation Post Delta was 45 kilometers northeast of the base, located in terrain that offered multiple advantages to defenders, but significant challenges for helicopter operations. The approach routes were limited by the surrounding mountains, and the landing zone at the observation post was barely large enough for a single helicopter. "Ma'am," Communications Specialist Johnson interrupted. "Bravo 72 is reporting increased enemy activity. They think the Taliban are preparing for a final assault on their position." The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Taliban forces had clearly planned to overwhelm the observation post through sustained pressure, and they were succeeding. Without immediate intervention, the entire platoon would be overrun within the hour, resulting in either mass casualties or the capture of American soldiers, an unacceptable outcome under any circumstances. "Get me Captain Brooks on the radio," Reeves ordered. "I need to brief Mercy Flight on their next mission." Madison was completing post-flight inspections on their damaged helicopter when the radio call came through. The aircraft showed the effects of their previous mission in dozens of bullet holes, hydraulic fluid stains, and warning placards that maintenance personnel had attached to various systems. Despite the battle damage, the helicopter remained functional, though operating it required constant attention to degraded systems and reduced performance margins. "Mercy Flight, this is base operations," the radio crackled with urgency. "Report to Tolk immediately for priority mission briefing." Brooks acknowledged the transmission while Madison secured the aircraft and gathered her flight gear. Around them, maintenance crews were working frantically to repair other helicopters, their tools sparking against metal as they welded patches over bullet holes and replaced damaged components. The base's aircraft were being pushed beyond normal operating limits, but the alternative was leaving American soldiers without the air support they desperately needed. The briefing room was packed with aircrew members receiving assignments for various missions across the region. Madison found herself sitting next to Major Lisa Chun, pilot of one of the Apache gunships that would be providing fire support for their mission. Chun was a veteran of multiple deployments whose reputation for precision gunnery had earned her the nickname Surgeon among her fellow pilots. "Gentlemen, ladies," Colonel Reeves began, "we have an infantry platoon surrounded at Observation Post Delta, 28 soldiers, 14 wounded, ammunition running low. Enemy strength estimated at 150 fighters and prepared positions. This is going to be a challenging extraction." She gestured toward the tactical map where the observation post position was marked with a blue pin surrounded by red markers indicating enemy positions. "The approach routes are limited by terrain, and the landing zone will only accommodate one helicopter at a time. We'll need to sequence the extraction carefully to minimize exposure time while ensuring we get everyone out." Madison studied the map, noting the elevation lines and terrain features that would affect their approach to the landing zone. The observation post occupied a hilltop position that offered excellent defensive advantages but would require helicopters to approach through valleys where enemy forces could engage them from elevated positions. It was exactly the kind of tactical situation that favored defenders over rescue aircraft. "What's the plan for suppression?" Brooks asked from across the room. "Two Apaches will establish an orbit pattern to provide continuous fire support," Reeves replied. "They'll focus on neutralizing heavy weapons positions while the transport aircraft conduct the extraction. Expected mission duration is 90 minutes from takeoff to recovery of all personnel." Major Chun leaned forward in her seat. "Ma'am, what's the enemy anti-aircraft threat assessment?" "Unknown but potentially significant," Reeves answered honestly. "We have unconfirmed reports of possible SAM systems in the area, so all aircraft will maintain tactical spacing and be prepared for evasive maneuvers." The briefing continued with detailed coordination procedures, communication protocols, and contingency plans for various scenarios that might develop during the mission. Madison took careful notes, but her mind was also processing the broader implications of what they were being asked to do. This would be the most dangerous mission she had attempted, requiring precise flying in a heavily defended area while operating an aircraft with degraded systems. As the briefing concluded, aircrew members dispersed to their helicopters to begin final preparations. Madison walked back to her aircraft with Brooks and Martinez, all three understanding that they were about to attempt something that pushed the boundaries of what was tactically feasible with their available resources. "How confident are you about the hydraulic system?" Madison asked Martinez as they approached their helicopter. "It'll hold together long enough to complete the mission," Martinez replied, though her tone suggested she was less certain than her words indicated. "The real question is whether we can maintain precise control during the approach and landing phases when we need it most." Brooks was already reviewing the approach charts and calculating fuel requirements for the mission. "We'll be operating at maximum gross weight with a full load of soldiers, and the high altitude at the observation post will reduce our performance margins significantly. It's going to be tight." Madison nodded, understanding the technical challenges they faced. The combination of battle damage, high-altitude operations, and maximum weight would push their helicopter to its operational limits. Any additional complications during the mission could quickly turn a challenging rescue into an emergency situation requiring rescue themselves. "Mercy Flight, this is base operations," the radio announced. "You are cleared for immediate departure. Observation Post Delta. Reports enemy assault beginning. Time is critical." Madison strapped into her seat and began the engine start sequence, her movements automatic despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. This was the moment she had been training for since flight school, a mission where technical skill, tactical judgment, and personal courage would determine whether 28 American soldiers lived or died. As the helicopter lifted off from forward operating base Sentinel and turned northeast toward the mountains, Madison had no way of knowing that she was about to face the ultimate test of everything she believed about duty, sacrifice, and what it meant to be a combat pilot. The next 90 minutes would either establish her reputation as an exceptional aviator or end her military career in the most final way possible. But for now, there was only the mission ahead and the knowledge that somewhere in those mountains, American soldiers were counting on her to bring them home. The radio call that would change everything came at 0347 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like a knife. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Bravo 7-2. We are taking heavy fire and have multiple casualties. Request immediate extraction. Grid coordinates follow." Madison Torres had been in the air for 37 minutes, her damaged Black Hawk struggling through the thin mountain air toward Observation Post Delta. The helicopter's compromised hydraulic system made every control input feel sluggish and unpredictable, while warning lights cast an eerie red glow across the instrument panel. Through her night vision goggles, the Afghan mountains appeared as a ghostly green landscape of jagged peaks and deep valleys that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. "Mercy Flight, this is Sword 1-1, Major Chun's voice crackled through the radio from her Apache gunship. "We have eyes on the target area. Enemy positions are extensive and well coordinated. This is going to be a hot extraction." Madison could see the Apache helicopters ahead of her, their distinctive silhouettes outlined against the stars as they began their attack runs on Taliban positions surrounding the observation post. Streams of 30mm cannon fire reached down from the gunships like deadly fingers, while Hellfire missiles streaked toward heavy weapons positions in brilliant flashes of light. "Bravo 7-2, this is Mercy Flight," Brooks called to the besieged. "Infantry platoon, we are 5 minutes out from your position. Prepare for immediate extraction on my command." The response from Lieutenant Webb was barely audible over the sound of intense gunfire. "Mercy Flight, understand 5 minutes. Be advised we are taking effective fire from all directions. Landing zone is hot and we have multiple urgent casualties requiring immediate medical attention." Madison could see the observation post now. A small collection of sandbagged positions on a hilltop that was lit by muzzle flashes and exploding mortar. Tracer rounds arced through the air like deadly fireworks, while the distinctive sound of heavy machine guns echoed across the mountains. The Taliban assault was reaching its climax, and time was running out for the American soldiers holding the position. Sword 1-1 is engaging targets on the north slope, Chun reported, her Apache diving toward a cluster of enemy positions. Multiple RPG teams neutralized. Mercy Flight, you have a narrow window for approach from the southeast. Madison studied the tactical situation, calculating angles and distances while the helicopter bucked and shuddered through the turbulent mountain air. The approach to the landing zone would require threading between enemy positions while maintaining enough altitude to clear the surrounding ridgelines. With their damaged hydraulic system, precision flying would be more challenging than ever. Going in, Madison announced, beginning her descent toward the observation post. The helicopter dropped rapidly through the thin air, using the terrain to mask their approach until the last possible moment. As they became visible to enemy fighters, the intensity of ground fire increased dramatically. The landing zone at Observation Post Delta was barely large enough for a single helicopter, surrounded by fighting positions and communication equipment that left minimal clearance for rotor blades. Madison had to set the aircraft down with surgical precision while enemy bullets sparked off the armor plating and rocket-propelled grenades exploded nearby. "We're on the ground," Madison called as the helicopter settled onto the rocky hilltop. "Load casualties immediately." Staff Sergeant Martinez was already at the cabin door, coordinating with the infantry soldiers who emerged from their fighting positions carrying wounded comrades. The first casualty was Sergeant First Class Williams, the platoon sergeant who had taken shrapnel to his chest and was barely conscious. As they loaded him onto a stretcher, Madison could see that his injuries were severe and potentially fatal without immediate surgical intervention. "How many casualties total?" Brooks asked Lieutenant Webb, who was directing the evacuation while continuing to coordinate defensive fire. 14 wounded, 6 critical, Webb replied, his voice hoarse from shouting orders over the gunfire. "My RTO took a round to the head 20 minutes ago. Without him, I can't coordinate fire support effectively." The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Without effective radio communication, the infantry platoon was losing its ability to direct Apache fire support against enemy positions. Taliban fighters were using the confusion to move closer to the observation post, and Madison could see muzzle flashes appearing from positions that had been quiet just minutes earlier. "Mercy Flight, this is Sword 1-1, Chun's urgent voice came through the radio. "I'm seeing enemy movement from multiple directions. They're trying to overrun the position while you're on the ground." Madison felt the helicopter lurch as a heavy machine gun round punched through the tail boom, but the aircraft's flight controls remained responsive. The loading of casualties was taking longer than anticipated due to the severity of their injuries and the need to provide medical stabilization before transport. "We need to go now," Brooks called from the right seat, his eyes fixed on the enemy fighters who were advancing on their position. "Negative," Madison replied, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. "We're not leaving anyone behind." It was a decision that went against standard tactical doctrine, which emphasized minimizing exposure time during contested landings. But Madison could see the wounded soldiers still being loaded and knew that departing prematurely would doom them to death or capture. Sometimes the most important decisions were made not by following procedures, but by understanding what was right. The next few minutes unfolded like a slow-motion nightmare. Taliban fighters had worked their way to within 50 meters of the landing zone, close enough that Madison could see individual faces through her night vision goggles. The remaining healthy soldiers formed a defensive perimeter around the helicopter, their weapons chattering as they engaged targets that seemed to materialize from every direction. Last casualty loaded, Martinez called from the cabin. But we're taking fire from the LZ perimeter. I can see enemy fighters moving into our departure path. Madison had already identified the problem. Taliban forces had positioned themselves along the only viable departure route, creating a gauntlet of fire that the helicopter would have to fly through during takeoff. With their damaged systems and maximum load of wounded soldiers, the aircraft would be particularly vulnerable during the critical climbing phase of flight. Sword 1-1, I need immediate suppression along our departure route, Madison called. To the Apache gunships. We're heavy and slow, and they're positioned to knock us down during climb-out. Copy, Mercy Flight. Beginning gun runs on your departure route now. The Apache helicopters dove toward the enemy positions with their 30mm cannons blazing, sending clouds of rock and debris into the air as high explosive rounds impacted among the Taliban fighters. But Madison could see that some positions remained active, and she knew the suppression would only provide temporary relief. Mercy Flight, this is Bravo 7-2. Lieutenant Webb's voice came through the radio with desperate urgency. My remaining soldiers are ready for extraction, but I don't think we can hold this position much longer. Madison looked at the instrument panel, calculating weight, fuel, and performance parameters for what she was about to attempt. The helicopter was already at maximum gross weight with the wounded soldiers aboard, and adding Webb's remaining 14 soldiers would push the aircraft well beyond its normal operating limits. In the thin air at high altitude, with battle damage affecting their systems, it would be an extremely marginal operation. Load them, Madison said simply. Brooks turned to look at her, understanding the implications of what she was attempting. Madison, we're going to be way over gross weight. With the hydraulic problems and the altitude, I'm not sure we can maintain controlled flight. Then we'll find out, Madison replied, her voice steady with determination. We're not leaving anyone on this hill. The loading of the remaining soldiers took place under increasing enemy fire as Taliban fighters closed in on the observation post from multiple directions. Madison could hear bullets impacting the helicopter's fuselage with increasing frequency, while the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar added urgency to the evacuation. Everyone's aboard, Martinez called from the cabin, which was now packed with 28 soldiers in various states of injury and exhaustion. But we are seriously overloaded. Madison pulled pitch and felt the helicopter struggle to lift off. With its massive load, the aircraft rose slowly from the landing zone, wallowing in the thin air as she coaxed every bit of performance from the overloaded machine. Enemy fire followed them as they climbed, with tracer rounds reaching up toward them like deadly fingers. Taking fire from multiple positions, Brooks reported, his voice tight with concentration as he monitored their climb rate and engine parameters. We're barely maintaining altitude. The helicopter was indeed struggling, its engine straining against the combination of high altitude, maximum weight, and battle damage. Madison could feel the aircraft on the edge of controllability, requiring constant control inputs to maintain level flight. But they were flying, and more importantly, they were carrying 28 American soldiers away from certain death or capture. Mercy Flight, this is Sword 1-1. Chun's voice came through the radio with evident admiration. Outstanding flying. You just pulled off something that shouldn't have been possible. As they flew through the mountain valleys toward forward operating base Sentinel, Madison reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Months earlier, she had been dismissed as just transport, a pilot whose role was seen as less important than those who flew attack helicopters. But tonight, she had proven that courage and skill could not be measured by the type of aircraft someone flew, but by their willingness to risk everything when others needed them most. The landing at the base medical facility was rougher than Madison would have preferred, but all 28 soldiers were alive as medical teams rushed to transfer them to the emergency treatment facility. As she watched stretcher bearers carry the wounded toward the hospital, Madison caught sight of Lieutenant Webb, who paused to look back at the helicopter that had saved his platoon. "Thank you," he said simply, his words carrying the weight of 28 lives preserved. In the months that followed, the story of that night would become legend among the aviation units serving in Afghanistan. Madison Torres, the pilot they had called Just Transport, had proven that sometimes the most important victories came not from the aircraft with the biggest guns, but from the aviators with the biggest hearts. The official after-action report would note that her actions had saved 28 American lives during one of the most challenging rescue operations of the deployment. But for Madison, the real victory was simpler and more personal. She had done her job, brought her fellow soldiers home, and proven that when everything was on the line, there was no such thing as just transport. Years later, when asked about that night, Madison would say that she was simply doing what any pilot would have done in the same situation. But those who were there knew better. They had witnessed something extraordinary, a moment when training, courage, and determination combined to achieve what seemed impossible, and proved that heroism was measured not by the weapons you carried, but by the lives you were willing to risk everything to save. The helicopter that carried them home that night was eventually retired from service, its battle damage too extensive for continued operations. But the legend of what Madison Torres accomplished in those mountains lived on, inspiring a new generation of pilots to understand that there were no small roles in combat aviation, only small people who were unwilling to rise to the challenge. When their moment came, Madison Torres had risen to her challenge, and in doing so had transformed from someone seen as just transport into someone recognized as exactly what she had always been, a combat pilot willing to do whatever it took to bring her fellow soldiers home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.